is Grant Faber, and I'm a researcher with the University of Michigan Global CO2 Initiative. Today I will be talking about our life cycle assessment template, which was created as part of the AssessCCUS project, which itself was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. And the purpose of the project was to create a website, which you can find at assessccus.globalco2initiative.org, a website to provide accessible resources related to life cycle assessment and techno-economic assessment, specifically for carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. So if you look throughout the website, you'll see that it contains overviews, databases, videos, and of course these templates, one for LCA, one for TEA, one of which, this LCA one, I will be talking about today. So this video describes our LCA template. We filmed a separate one for a TEA template, which you can also find on our website. And more types of templates may be coming in the near future. So you should keep your eyes out for those. Also, as a note, you can download this template and our other templates in the corresponding sections of our website. So to start, as you can see, this life cycle assessment template exists as an Excel workbook. So you'll need Microsoft Excel to be able to download and to change this model around. You can see on the bottom here different worksheets, and each of these different worksheets represents a different stage of the LCA process that we kind of separated out here. This first page here, this is the About Us page, and it just offers some background information on the template, on the project, and so forth. And one other thing to note here is that all of this in the template, all of these different steps and the different sections included within are based on the techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment guidelines for CO2 utilization, which you can find on the Global CO2 Initiative's website and at this link here in this first author section. So one final thing to note before we really get started is that there may be improvements to this template over time. So we may, in the course of using this template and getting feedback and so forth, we may have certain updates that we do to the template and publish on the site. So the model that you are looking at that you've downloaded possibly recently from the website may look just a bit different from this one, but the core structure should still be the same. So with that, we will jump into talking through this life cycle assessment template. So again, this first worksheet is just the about. It really just provides some background on the template and so forth. So the purpose, so the goal is to help streamline the process of conducting LCA for emerging CCUS technologies based on the Global CO2 Initiative's guidelines and the recommendations laid out within. In terms of how to use, you can go throughout this worksheet, and we'll talk about it in this video today, but essentially you fill in the different boxes in the goal and scope worksheets, go in the inventory, insert relevant data, perform the impact assessment, and then interpret the information and write up conclusions in that final worksheet there. In terms of intended audiences, so hopefully anyone who is interested in performing an LCA of CCUS technologies can find value in this template. Over the particular audiences that we had in mind include ones like technology developers, assessment practitioners, entrepreneurs, researchers, and so on, people who are very frequently involved in the value chain of trying to commercialize and kind of improve the environmental performance of CCUS technologies. So next, tips. These are just a couple things here that may ease the process of using this template. One thing that we find to be very, very helpful is listing sources and other sorts of small explanations and comments throughout the worksheet. So this is very helpful if you say, share your template with someone else to use, and maybe it's not totally apparent to them where you may have procured certain data. And it's also useful for yourself if, say, a few months go by and you're looking at this model again, and you say, well, where did I find that data, etc. It's easy to forget those things over time. So listing comments is particularly useful. Writing explanations and notes areas, specifically in the inventory, impact assessment worksheets is helpful, again, for either yourself when referencing the template later, or when sharing it with others to whom such information may not be completely apparent. Avoiding formulas and inventory worksheet is somewhat helpful, as we'll talk about in a moment, or in a little bit. And of course, making on and off switches throughout the model, usually in the inventory, can help expedite scenario analysis and allow for other interesting interesting uses of the model. So in terms of templates, so we designed this template to really function for low technology readiness level, kind of early stage technologies where maybe only several impact categories are being assessed. So because of that, there's many possible expansions. Of course, there are many journals and academic articles focused on LCA and all of the things that one can do. And so there's really a lot of potential expansions to the kind of generic process modeled in this template. And so these things can include including more space, doing more data visualizations, adding more steps, more impact categories, maybe moving into a little more consequential LCA, looking at marginal changes rather than just using average production data, trying to do global sensitivity analysis, etc. So there's really a lot that can be added to this template, but it's really meant to serve as a kind of base to work off of. And then at the bottom here, we just have a little disclaimer, which we may add to or modify with time, but essentially the initiative takes no responsibility for errors and mistakes and so forth and other issues with the template. And so with that, I will move on to the goal worksheet. So as you can see here at the top, we have a kind of title section for you to put the title of your project, name, email, and so forth. Again, this is useful if others will be looking at this model and may need to get in touch with you, and the date is useful for similar reasons, just knowing when the analysis was conducted and if it might be out of date or not. So anyway, moving on, we have different sections of the template, and you'll see these colors throughout. So just the green is basically the title of a worksheet, and this kind of darker gray shading is just it represents different sections. So these headers are kind of different sections of related information throughout here. And so we have these boxes here, and again, this is potential expansion, but you may find that there's not enough room when you go to write up thoughts, or when you go to write up which belongs in any of these particular boxes. And so it's easy enough to go here and to insert rows as needed, merge and center the boxes again, and just write more. And so, you know, that's the model is designed to be flexible in that way, so you can change things around, delete boxes as needed, and so forth to really make it work for you. So in the goal worksheet here, this is essentially the background of the study and trying to elucidate things related to the purpose, the involved partners, the commissioners, and so forth. We have a section on limitations here, so I won't dive into each of these boxes individually, and hopefully many of them it's kind of apparent what they represent. And one thing to note explicitly here too is that the existing write-ups in many of these boxes are just for this kind of generic default chemical process that this template is modeling. So we chose to just use this kind of generic process so that it's not distracting. And while we may have pulled a couple things here and there from an actual real process, ideally when you were using this template for your own assessment needs, you'll really want to go through and fill in every single one of these boxes and every single parameter with custom data and custom information related to your project, so that it's as useful and as transparent as possible. And another note here too is that we have these snapshots kind of throughout the template that come from the Global CO2 Initiative's guidelines. And so here what we see is a table representing different TRLs or technology readiness levels. And the idea for putting this table here is to allow users of the template to look at the descriptions here on the side, so that it informs what they might write in the technology readiness level portion here. So there's a couple of these throughout just to provide a little bit of help for maybe some of the more complicated parts of performing the assessment and using the template. However, of course, these are just snapshots. The guidelines, a lot of work went into them, and it's dozens of pages, and we recommend looking into those and kind of going along with the guidelines, especially as you're doing these assessments for the first time, just to ensure that you're meeting them and considering all of the necessary things to perform a good LCA for CCUS. So let's see. So there's different sections here. Again, the general information or the kind of generic stuff should hopefully be a guide in terms of what to fill in these different sections for your own process. At the bottom here, we have different scenarios for the study, and so this will come up through a few times throughout going through the template here today. The base case is just the default scenario, so if you don't turn on any scenario switches or anything like that, this is just what the model is modeling. This is what the template is modeling, and then we have these two scenarios here as well, with the first representing low carbon electricity in the second being used in the process, and the second representing the replacement of one of the constituent raw materials in the process. And so those will come up again later. So moving on to the scope worksheet. So the scope worksheet essentially outlines what the project is focusing on, things like the system boundary, what different processes and so forth are being assessed, and what's maybe being excluded. Often the scope is one of the most important parts of doing an LCA because it just defines what is even being assessed, what is being covered, and it's good to be very transparent about what's included and what's excluded in the study. And so because of that, you can see we have a few snapshots here from the guidelines that should hopefully be helpful in terms of determining a functional unit, which is one of the key aspects of performing an LCA, which is essentially what it's a quantified description of the application of the final product, or essentially the kind of basis on which one is allocating impacts. And so a lot of thought needs to go into setting the functional unit, and I won't go into it in this video, but hopefully from these snapshots on the right and reading through the guidelines and maybe also the AssessCCUS website, you can understand a little more about how to go about setting a functional unit and the kinds of recommendations and pitfalls that might go into that. So in the scope, so we have things related to the product overall and the functional unit. Moving on, we have a small section focused on system elements, also called unit processes, which are essentially, again, what's being included and what's being excluded from the system, kind of represented in a graphical format as well here. And so what you can see is that we have this system, we have process 1, process 2, and process 3, and these are all transforming raw materials using energy while also producing waste in order to get to this kind of final product here, this kind of final economically or technologically useful product. That's kind of the purpose of this whole process. And so it's really important to outline, well, what exactly is going into this and kind of what's being assessed. And so often in LCA, you'll hear these terms cradle to gate or cradle to grave, which essentially represent, well, when are you cutting off the analysis? And so a cradle to grave assessment will look at every stage of a product's life cycle. So from the sourcing of the raw materials all the way to the end of life of that product. Whereas cradle to gate, which is the case in this kind of generic template, basically means that you are assessing the system from the beginning of its life cycle, so from the sourcing of raw materials until the final factory gate, which in this case is just the final product being shipped out. And there's different guidance and guidelines that go into figuring out how one should properly set system boundaries, which again I won't go into here, but any sort of discussion related to that will go in the scope worksheet here. And then we have sections on multifunctionality. So basically, are there wastes being used in the process, or are there byproducts or co-products, which will all have potentially implications in terms of where impacts are allocated. Some discussion of the benchmark product. So what is the product that one is modeling being compared to, if anything at all? And then the impact assessment approach. So essentially here, what kinds of environmental impacts are being assessed as part of the study. So let's see, moving on, we'll go to the inventory. So in the inventory worksheet, what we essentially do is we list all of the different parameters used by the model. In terms of this sheet, we chose to keep actual formulas out. So if you go to these different cells that are for the different parameters and you look at the formula bar, you'll notice that there aren't any formulas being used on the sheet. And now the reason for this is to essentially keep things a little cleaner, just to kind of separate these things out. But mainly it's because the inventory parameters may need to be changed by someone at a later date, or they may need to be changed by someone who is not the actual person who designed the model, in which case it's important that formulas are not being erased or being changed. If someone is going to change this input data, it's preferable that they don't disrupt the model in that kind of way. So it's good to separate out the actual, basic numeric inputs into the model from for further kinds of calculations, which are included in a separate section, the impact assessment worksheet, which I'll talk about shortly. So starting to go through these sections here, we have production parameters. So these just represent high-level information about the process, so how much of the final material is being produced, what are the kind of comparison emissions and energy use from the benchmark product, it's again to be used for comparison. So this is just kind of high-level data that's necessary for the study. Here in the scenario specification section, we have an area where you can actually change the scenarios here, and then when you flip these switches on or off, it will propagate through the rest of the model. So for example, if you change the 0 to a 1 here for low carbon electricity, it will change the results layer in the model to basically represent what the process would be, or what the emissions and energy use from the process would be if it were using low carbon electricity. The same is true with raw material replacement. And if you were to turn both on at the same time, this would represent a non-listed scenario, but one essentially where you're using low carbon electricity as well as replacing one of the raw materials. And so it's important to pay attention to how these are set, because it obviously impacts what the model is ultimately representing. And just as a note, if they're both 0, then the model is representing the default scenario or the base case of the study. So the next section, we have material flow. So this essentially defines the different materials going into the process. So here you can see, for example, raw material 2, here it's 15.6 liters of this raw material being used per kilogram of the final product produced. There's many different ways to represent material flow in a system. In this kind of baseline template, this is just how we chose to represent it. But again, this is something that may need to be added or changed based on your own needs. And we made the model, again, I think I've mentioned this a few times, but we've made the model such that it's meant to be flexible, and it's meant to be updated and changed around based on whatever your particular needs are. And so if you were to add raw materials or something, you would just go here, you would just insert rows, and then you would just insert the needed information there, and then update the rest of the model accordingly. And so we have similar parameters here for waste proportion. And so the reason we have 2 sets is because the waste might, for example, look different if we were replacing one of the raw materials or not. And so anyway, it's not extremely important, but it's just all this is just demonstrating that any sort of parameters related to the raw materials can go into this section. One note is that you'll see these comments on these cells here, user, right source here, and this just relates to what I was talking about earlier, which is the importance of this is just a reminder, essentially, to add the source of the particular data in the comment box on that cell, because it will help you find it later, it helps others find it, and if you go to eventually prepare a report or an academic journal article based on this, it makes citing the sources just much easier if you have them on hand. And we also, as you'll notice, have these notes section, which again are similarly useful for helping yourself understand what you were doing, or also it helps explain each of the individual parameters to a potential separate user other than yourself of the model. Next section, we have machine parameters. So this is just some high-level information about the machines used in all of the different processes. Essentially here, what's going on is the model is trying to calculate, or it's just using this data, which is then used later on to calculate the energy needs for each of the each of the machines, which are relevant to obviously the final environmental impact level. So here we have a sensitivity analysis working section and an uncertainty analysis working section. Now, ideally, these working sections should not be included in the inventory worksheet because technically uncertainty and sensitivity analysis are part of the interpretation phase of the study, which is kind of an iterative phase, but it really should come after the final impact assessment. The reason that these sections or that this analysis is here for this worksheet is that Excel requires that data tables, which are the tool being used here for the assessment, requires that data tables are in the same worksheet as the input data. And so here, reference machine 1 power, you see that that's in this cell here, C58. And so because this sensitivity analysis in particular is varying that, this data table needs to be located here. So do note that this is something that you may need to come back to after you finish the impact assessment worksheet and that analysis, and you may need to run these. So it's not necessarily the kind of template where you'll linearly work throughout it. You'll need to kind of revisit things and go back and forth, which in all honesty, it represents the process of LCA, where the interpretation phase is iterative and you're thinking throughout doing the whole study, whether you need to go back and reassess something that you're doing. Maybe you weren't able to find data that would be necessary to do the modeling to achieve the goal of the study, or maybe there's something else that comes up or needs to be updated throughout. So it is an iterative process, but there's something to note here about these particular sections. One other note is that this template just uses data tables to do this, these analyses, but there are ways to use other tools. For example, there's various Excel add-ins that can be downloaded or purchased, or different kinds of VBA code, for example, that can be used to generate, say, a tornado diagram or a spider chart, something along those lines for sensitivity analysis, or that may be used for, say, a Monte Carlo analysis in the uncertainty analysis section as well. In this kind of generic default model, again, we're just using the Excel data table functionality, which is located in data what if analysis and data table, which you can read more about online, but there are other ways to perform those analyses. Moving on, this is the impact assessment worksheet. And essentially what's going on here is we have 3 different primary sections. One is on intermediate calculations, which we'll talk about first. We have a summary of results, and then assessment factors. Starting with intermediate calculations, these are essentially where there are calculations going on that are sort of necessary as part of the life cycle inventory, but we didn't want to include on that worksheet because of what we had said before about it not being so desirable to have different formulas on the inventory sheet, because someone is altering that data in the future. You wouldn't want them to, say, change one of these formulas, which might disrupt the rest of change it manually, which might disrupt the rest of the model or make it hard to recover the proper formula that was there. So as you can see, these are intermediate calculations, as these are being performed as an intermediate between the life cycle inventory and the actual impact assessment calculations. And so they're performed with different parameters from the inventory sheet. So as you can see here, in cell C48, for example, we have inventory C10, which represents the operating capacity of the plant, which is 90% in this case, multiplied by the days per year, averaging out, this 0.25 is from leap years, times 24 hours per day. And so that's used to get this intermediate result of the number of hours per year that the plant is operating, which is then useful in calculating energy use from the different machines, which is again relevant. And so, yeah, that kind of, all of the intermediate stuff goes into this section, and then the results from this section ultimately are used in conjunction with these impact assessment factors for the final summary. But I want to talk about these impact assessment factors. So essentially, we have these different sections here: materials, energy, wastes, and we have these factors here that are that one multiplies by whatever the corresponding amount of material or energy waste is in order to figure out, in this case, the level of emissions or the energy demand associated with that need of the process. And so essentially what's going on here is that we have these factors that are pulled from databases that represent, for example, the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per, say, kilogram of raw material one. And now, because this is a generic model, a lot of these don't exactly represent a real material or a real energy source. They're just kind of placeholder values. And so you will want to actually go into a life cycle assessment database of some sort, something like EcoInvent or USLCI or something, to actually find real values to plug in here. And as you can see, there's an area to leave comments here as well for how you obtain this. But essentially, you'll plug in all of these different factors, and then how the model is structured at this time is that depending on the scenario that's selected and depending on how much of each raw material are being used, there's a calculation here. So the total impact per kilogram of the final product produced. And so you see that there's one for climate change, one for energy demand here for all of these. And this box here shows how, or it discusses how you, with a more advanced analysis, one may want to add further columns representing further impact categories as well. So of course here we're just looking at climate change, we're just looking at energy demands from the process, as these are often some of the most important to look at if the main concern of say a commissioner is mitigating climate change. But of course there are many other relevant environmental impacts from a given process, things like acidification, ozone depletion, toxicity, and so forth. And so the model is structured in such a way that it should be easy enough to add columns here to the right representing these different impacts. And essentially what it would look like is, it might say acidification in this cell, and the unit might be kilograms of sulfur dioxide equivalents. And then you would just find the corresponding factors to then be multiplied by the amounts of each raw material that are being used as part of the process. And so we do that with materials, energy, and waste, kind of the three main drivers of impact for the system. And then finally here we have the summary, or where the summary of the impact assessment goes. And so at the top here we have a summary, or we have some high-level calculations here. So per kilogram of the final product produced, and per year, kind of what are the total impacts. And so you can see here that there's roughly 68 kilograms of CO2 equivalents being produced in order to produce each kilogram of the final product. And then you can see there's about 800 or so megajoules of energy required. So that's just kind of at a high level. And we also break these down in the template by each individual contributor. And the point here is to help construct these pie charts, which kind of help visualize, well, what are the biggest contributors to each of these environmental impacts. And so you can see here, natural gas is the highest here in terms of climate change, and it's also the highest in terms of energy demand. And so, for example, that might help inform final recommendations, which I'll talk about in a minute. So you can produce these graphics here, things like pie charts and other things based on the impact assessment summary. You may desire to create other kinds of graphics or data visualizations, and that can be done with Excel, insert, and charts. And there's a lot of different options here. Obviously, there's not so much space here in the template, so you may want to add the templates below this impact assessment factors, or you may want to add the visualizations below the impact assessment factors section here, where there's a little more space to work. And this is also true if you want to add more impact categories as well. And then you would want to adjust the model accordingly if you were to make such a change. But again, the template is designed to be flexible, and you should edit it according to whatever your needs are for modeling your particular system. Finally, we have the interpretation worksheet. And so the structure here, the interpretation worksheet is really meant to be filled out after all of the other steps are completed, although it's technically, as I mentioned, an iterative process where you're interpreting results as you're going through the study. But in terms of actually filling out the insights and recommendations, usually you can only do that once the impact assessment worksheet is kind of filled out and is complete. But first, we have insights, which are basically just the results of the study. What did you find? What are the main impacts? What are the sensitivity, scenario, and uncertainty analyses showing, and so forth. We have a section here for recommendations as well. So you may or may not want to include these depending on the goal of your study. But here they're a bit normative, and we're essentially trying to make recommendations to, say, the user of the study on how to reduce the environmental impact, which in this case is represented by climate change and cumulative energy demand. And so filling out these boxes would involve looking at, again, what are the highest impacts, or what are the main drivers of the environmental impacts of something like natural gas, raw materials, raw material 1, you see raw material 2 for cumulative energy demand, and so forth, and kind of making a recommendation to those responsible for developing the technology to think about, okay, well, if I want to effectively reduce the impact, what aspects of the process should I target? And that's kind of what these recommendation boxes cover. And then we have sections for scenario, sensitivity, and uncertainty analysis, one for each, that just include kind of the findings from each of those types of analysis. And another thing to note here, as is noted in the study, is that for the purposes of the template, only a few variables were tested for each kind of analysis. A full study may want to assess many more, or even none at all, depending on the goal of the study and depending on the interest of the researcher and so forth. But here we just assessed 3 for each of sensitivity and uncertainty, just to kind of demonstrate what goes into this, what goes into the analysis and so forth. So with that, I believe that concludes the overview of this template. So please watch out on the AssessCCUS website for further updates to this template and possibly new templates with time. And if you have any questions, comments, or other kinds of feedback, either for the AssessCCUS site or for this template in general, please reach out to us on the contact form on the Global CO2 Initiative's website. We would certainly love to hear from you and try to improve these tools for everyone to use over time. So with that, thank you very much.